Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Greg Appelbaum from Duke University, linking the brain and behavior in sports, new research on sports vision testing and training. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Greg Appelbaum. Greg is an associate professor and director of the Opti Lab at Duke University. As you will hear, his research covers a wide range of topics related to understanding the link between the brain and behavior in high-performance domains, including sports, and how we can use this information to optimize performance. In the interview, we cover topics including predicting sports performance from vision testing, the transfer of dynamic vision training to sports, and possible ways in which brain stimulation and EEG could be used to enhance training. Hope you enjoy. So today I'm joined by Greg Appelbaum from Duke University. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Greg.
It's my pleasure. I'm a big fan of the show and happy to be on.
Great. And to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in kind of what you study, vision, sports science?
Yeah. So I am a cognitive neuroscientist by training, meaning I'm interested in brain behavior relationships, which is pretty eclectic because we all have brains, we all have behaviors. And in this work, in this research we do, we're studying the relationship between brain and behavior, and we're using measurement tools of behavior, and we're using measurement tools of brain. And I have a lab at Duke called the Human Performance Optimization Lab, or Opti Lab for short. So that should give you a clue about what we're interested in brain and behavior, which is using information about the brain to optimize behavior, which really amounts to trying to understand neuroplasticity. So learning is how we optimize behaviors, encouraging optimal learning or retention of learned skills. And the research in my lab kind of falls in two buckets. Research funded by the Department of Defense, which is primarily focused on optimizing learning in high performers, so athletes, soldiers, surgeons, or research that's funded by the National Institute of Health, which is really more geared towards therapeutics and accelerating rehabilitation in either psychiatric or neurological populations.
Well, that's really interesting. And I guess we can get into it later on about how much similarity there are between those domains. And that's really interesting. And you did you grad school and everything at Duke as well?
No, actually, funny enough, I grew up in Chapel Hill. My dad was
okay, that's right.
and then I moved out west for 15 years, did my PhD at University of California, Irvine. Mm-hmm. And then my wife got a job at UNC, so we moved back. But they didn't really have a program in what I do. It's kind of a big cognitive neuroscience program, but Duke did. Mm-hmm. So I have been working at Duke for 15 years and have come to be at peace with the duality of the Duke-UNC rivalry and my personal allegiances.
That's funny. Yes, sometimes you have to do that. I do that too with teams I work with. Sometimes I have to work with teams that are the big rivals of my favorite team, which I try to not to let that get in the way.
I feel it makes me a better scientist personally. I'm more objective.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. So one of the main things, kind of too, you mentioned a little bit about what you do. One of the main areas I wanted to focus on that's kind of relevant to this podcast is the work you've done on vision testing of athletes. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of the types of visual abilities or sensory motor abilities you've tested and what you've looked at in that area?
Certainly. So I think this all serendipitously started at a conference about 10 years ago when some people from Nike came up to a poster that my colleague Steve Mitroff and I had. And they were interested in vision because they were developing tools for assessing and intervening or training vision in athletes. So they wanted to understand what are the visual abilities that are important for athletes so they can develop tools that are really fit in the optometric space for assessing vision, and then using that to understand how an individual fits into their norms relative to their peers, and then using that to guide interventions. So that was my entry point into this. We struck up a collaboration and we started doing research with first tools that were developed by Nike, but it's snowballed since then. And we work with tons of different devices, things we develop in my lab and things that are developed commercially. And it's really geared towards this assess, analyze, and improve model. So a big aim has been to understand what are these norms for individuals and how normative abilities that are visual or visual cognition, or in the spirit of the podcast, perception and action. So the ability to see and react. And so we started doing research with these tools, running lots of people through my lab. And then we were able to develop collaborations with a lot of the users who had these devices in the field. And then eventually we were able to get access to the big database from Nike and then subsequently from other different types of devices, where we've been able to ask questions that are geared towards what are the characteristic abilities of athletes of different sorts, genders, levels, sport types, and how do they relate to game performance? Meaning, if you perform better or worse on these evaluations of perception, vision, action, does that relate at all to your real world performance in actual games? So it's kind of cool that we get the ability to link these kind of stereotypical assessments with real world game performance.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, and one of the things you're talking about is the SPARQ. Is it the SPARQ Sensory Station? It's still called.
Yep.
Just for everyone's, these tests kind of run the gamut from things that we sometimes call visual hardware, right? That like basic acuity, stereo acuity, all up to more attentional things, right? And then there's also you had mentioned actually like hand-eye coordination things. Yeah, they kind of run the full gamut of things.
Yeah. So they were meant to be a kind of scaled battery that starts with measuring the things that you might do in an optometrist's office. So acuity and contrast sensitivity. And then it gets into more visual, what we call eye quickness, your ability to orient to new locations near and far, in the periphery, in the center. And then taking that to the next level is your ability to orient with your hands. So eye-hand coordination and to be able to respond and inhibit responses.
Right. And so what are kind of the general patterns? I know you mentioned this. How many was it? Over 2,000? You had the data set you had, and you looked at people from different sports, different levels within different sports, gender. What kind of some of the patterns that you found in that?
Yeah, so within the kind of two domains, one being what are the characteristics of individuals, and then how do they relate to game performance, we found that characteristics of individuals differ based upon how much experience they have playing sports. So people who are professionals tend to score better on these measures than collegiate athletes, than high school, than middle school. And that's true of really all different sorts, both things that are what we call hardware, acuity, contrast, sensitivity, and then those are even accentuated in motor skills. So when you're testing eye-hand coordination. So there's differences across levels of sport, which isn't that surprising. There are some differences across genders. Females tend to be able to have faster eye-hand coordination, controlling for the fact that they have shorter arms. That matters when you're measuring these things over space. But one of the most interesting findings, I think, from these studies has been looking at different types of sports. So we can classify athletes based upon whether they're playing interceptive or strategic sports. And so this is not a perfect classification, but it's used, with interceptive sports being things like tennis, baseball, softball. We're trying to intercept a fast-moving object, and strategic sports being sports where you're trying primarily to track teammates and opponents. So hockey, soccer, basketball. And what we find is that athletes who play interceptive sports tend to have better, what we call visual hardware. So they have better acuity, better contrast sensitivity. And athletes who play strategic sports tend to have better spatial vision. So things like spatial working memory, the ability to identify patterns and recall patterns. And that kind of fits the heuristic of what we think is encouraged in these sports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of leading my next question. I was wondering, why do you get these patterns? Is it, if I have poor acuity and good spatial working memory, do I choose and when I'm early on to play basketball more than baseball? Do you think actually playing the sport itself makes you develops these abilities? It's probably all of these answers, but just what do you think is the kind of underlying effects here?
Yeah, I'm gonna punt on that. The nature nurture question is certainly hard, and it's certainly important, and it's almost certainly both to some degree. In this line of research, where we're looking kind of cross-sectionally at a moment in time, we're not tracking these people from high school to middle school to college to pro. We're just looking at a snapshot. We can't really draw causal inferences. Did they get to be pro athletes because they had these abilities, or do they nurture these abilities through practice? I would point you to a really nice book called The Sports Gene by David Epstein, which is one of my favorites. He wrestles with these problems. We do lots of studies, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a few minutes, that are more geared towards training and learning, and there we can make more of a causal statement about plasticity and some of the nurture questions. But at the same time, those studies I was talking about that are cross-sectional, it's probably both.
Yeah. Other thing that you've done maybe gets a little bit more in this direction is you've done some ones where you try to predict performance based on. So the main from those ones, I think the main performance effect you're finding is level, right? Higher ability is higher level. Or were you also looking at in-game statistics or anything?
Yeah. So when we're talking about the other class of relationships, we're looking at not just cross-sectional across individuals, but actually taking in individuals who might be within the same class, like professional baseball players, and saying, does variability in that group of people relate to variability in how they perform in the games? And so we have a few papers in this space, which are really fun papers because we're getting access to this real world data. And one of the papers, we had about 300 professional baseball players, and we went in and we looked at what we call counting statistics, things like batting average, home runs, and whatnot, which is pretty lowbrow in today's analytical world. But in that study, we found that people who perform better on these batteries of tasks, really the Nike battery, produced better batting performance in things that would be considered plate discipline, meaning batting average, on-base percentage, strikeout rate, and walk rate. But they didn't relate to better performance in things like slugging percentage or pitching. So the intuition there is that better visual abilities, better perception, action, kind of holistically across this whole battery correlates with better performance at the plate, batting, decision-making at the plate. And a second study, which is currently under review, takes that another level and it adds in eye tracking measures. So we're working with another group, a company called Right Eye, which has developed a bunch of really cool vision assessments that can be done with a desktop eye tracker. And in this case, we're combining both the battery of tasks that were originally the Nike battery with these eye tracking measures. And now we're looking at a more advanced set of game statistics, which are pitch by pitch plate discipline measures. Mm-hmm. So instead of these aggregated season statistics, we're looking at each pitch, did they swing at a pitch that's in the zone or out of the zone? Mm-hmm. And the conclusion is quite similar. Better performance on these assessments predicts better plate discipline metrics. And it really seems to be heavily weighted towards better eye movements in that data set. Okay. So people who have better smooth pursuit eye movements, the ability to track things, tend to be more discerning at the plate. They tend to swing less at pitches that are out of the strike zone. They also tend to swing at less at pitches that are in the strike zone. So they're just overall more selective. And we infer that this may have to do with their ability to pick up information better. But it's important to note that in all these cases, these are real world data that we consider hypothesis generating, meaning we can look at these things in the wild, see relationships, and now our responsibility is to go back and retest or look at a separate sample and see if it holds. So that's the types of experiments we're doing now.
Yeah, and I know one of the things I think it's both, I think, a great advance in your paper and makes it challenging, I think, is some of the modeling, like the stats you've done. Like if you look at your papers, you're not simply correlating, right? You're using some more sophisticated modeling and stuff. So but maybe can you get a little idea of kind of the approach you use in that way?
Yeah, so we've taken an approach, what's called Bayesian modeling, which is basically making some prior assumptions about the distributions that we might expect, like people have positive reaction times or things of that nature, and then bootstrapping our data on top of these assumptions to see if we could then generate predictions from our own data. So this is a really useful technique because these aren't planned samples. We can't assign people into the major league group or the AAA group, right? Mm-hmm. This is, they happen that way. So we can leverage the variability in our data by using these Bayesian approaches rather than just coming at it and saying, X is correlated with Y. We could, I think, be a little bit more true to the fact that there's variability that's uncontrolled in the data, and therefore we use our data to draw inferences in a statistical manner, or really in a probabilistic manner.
Mm-hmm. No, I think, like I said, I think that's really good way to do it. I guess the last question I have about kind of the vision testing, and I know it's going to lead into the training side of things, but kind of where do you see this going, and where, what other things do we need to do in this area? Do you think, is this eventually going to be a thing we could use as a screening tool for baseball players, or some sort of assessment we could track, or what's kind of the practical application of all this?
Yeah, I think you're on the right line. These are assessments that we can do that might have potential predictive value towards how these people will play and perform on the field. And I would point to a new collaboration we have just developing with USA Baseball. It turns out that USA Baseball has their main base here for their player development pipeline is 15 minutes from my office.
Oh, nice.
Which is super convenient. And they bring in thousands of players who are in the development pipeline every year, and they measure the heck out of these players. They have them do all kinds of kinematic tests. They have them do all kinds of vision screening tests. They do these eye tracking measures. They do just a really robust battery of assessments, some of which they have evidence are predictive, and some of which they just kind of conventionally think, well, this must matter. So what we're doing with them is they're feeding us these assessment measures, and then we're able to get in their game statistic performance from their games that they have either at the player development pipeline camps or from their regular season games, for example, in college players. And we'll be able to hopefully find, in one case, we could try to replicate some of our previous findings, that the hypothesis generation from before can now be tested. But what would be really cool is if we'd be able to create a dashboard for a player that says, okay, here, based upon all of your peers that we tested, these are the characteristics in your peer group that were predictive of their future performance. And you're doing well or you're doing poorly compared to them. And therefore, these might be things you want to work on, or you might want to go see an optometrist and get correction, or you may want to work with a trainer, or you may want to use specific training tools. And I can talk more about the mapping between training tools and abilities in a few minutes when we talk about training.
Yeah, I guess, and that brings a question to me also. With these relationships you find, and kind of the predictive relationships, is it a matter, I think most people would accept at the bottom end, if you have a deficit, there's going to be a benefit. I guess is it the relationship threshold effect, or, as you keep improving the ability way above, you get your visual acuity to 20, 15, 20, 10, are we still getting benefit? I know that's you need a lot of data to answer a question like that, but what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I think it's contentious. I think if you ask optometrists, they say, yes, these low-level visual abilities really matter. And even above and beyond kind of being in the normal range. Obviously, if you have very poor visual abilities, you can't see and play the game. But once you're in the normal range, can you perform well enough? Well, I think a lot of people in the vision space think there's utility in making sure that's optimized, and there may be some benefits from that. If you go and you ask a lot of the sports scientists and the sports psychologists, they will oftentimes say, no, it's not the hardware. Once you have normal visual hardware, you're in a kind of corrected or have natural vision that's good enough. It's the software. It's your ability to process the information. And so, again, I'm pretty agnostic here. I'm coming at this from an exploratory space where we have access to data that may be able to shed light on this question and this debate. And we're finding some evidence. The signal's not really strong. I don't think a Major League Baseball scout would say, we're not going to draft this person because they were slightly poor in this acuity or they were slightly poor in this contrast sensitivity measure. But it is part of a holistic measurement approach. And what we're finding in the data, again, small signal and big numbers of people, that we're really leveraging the fact that we have a lot of data to look at, but there seems to be a signal there. So I think the optometrists are right and the sports scientists are right. There's not a lot of evidence, but there's a little evidence. And so it all comes back then to opportunity cost. If you can make small adjustments in vision that are easy, that could have a lot of long-term or downstream ramifications at a low cost.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely a fair perspective. And I really like your idea too of, just collecting this data. One idea I had many years ago was having like a baseball combine kind of thing where you measured and adding all these vision. I would love to see it added to the football combine too. So all of us scientists, they just collect these and then let's see what happens to players long term. It would be amazing, but maybe one day.
Maybe next time we have a combine baseball.
Yes, true.
Maybe a while.
Yeah, it might be. So yeah, let's move to the other side of the coin that you've been working on is training. And I think you were hinting at, right, a point that I like to make too. I think just because two things differ between athletes of different skill levels doesn't mean it's something worth training or there's a causal relationship. You really do need to get into where you show, if I get this better by doing some manipulation, it makes them performance better, then you can say a lot more.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the three steps in the hierarchy is it has to be important for the sport. So some of the stuff we're doing there showing there is a relationship between these abilities and performance. The second level is there has to be some plasticity. If you can't improve that ability at all, you're going nowhere. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is that you have to show that improving this ability then translates to improving on-field performance. And not everything you improve translates to on-field performance. And it's also fairly hard to do good science to get evidence that a training program in a well-controlled study actually produces evidence of improvement on the field. So it's a high bar for good science.
Yeah, definitely. I would say training studies are super hard. But one of the things you've done in this area is you've written a couple of really great review papers where you've looked at the training literature, both kind of in a couple different ways. And can you summarize kind of what you found? And I'm sure it's a familiar story to people listening, but kind of what you found in that area.
So I guess I'll start with one of the first things we did once we started collaborating with Nike was, and frequent listeners of your show have heard about the strobe glasses, but I'll review them really quickly here. Basically, the idea is that liquid crystal lenses that are in sports eyewear that you could put on, and they shutter open and closed. And the idea is that by training under these harder visual conditions, you have to attend more, you have to make do with less information, and you might reap the benefit of having trained under the harder conditions when you return back to normal vision. Mm-hmm. So it's analogous to resistance training, running at high altitude where the air is thin, competing at sea level. So this was not a novel idea that came from us. It didn't even come from Nike. It's actually been used for many years before that. But we now had this opportunity to start testing it. So we started doing some controlled trials where we'd have athletes train with the strobes and athletes train with strobes that were always transparent, so you could always see through them. And we started doing tests to see if the training of sports-related activities with the strobes led to changes in vision or sports performance relative to people who trained with the eyewear always transparent. And we did a few studies. You did a study with Luke Wilkins. You did maybe more than one. And the evidence is pretty sparse. I would say between our studies and then Luke and I did a review paper a year or two ago, kind of looking at the whole field. And the conclusion that we drew, looking at our studies and looking at the field at large, was there is some evidence of gains in tasks that measure fast foveal vision, meaning your ability to see things in the center of your gaze, not in the periphery. And when you're doing tasks that involve fast or faint visual stimuli, so not sustaining attention for long periods of time or using high contrast, easy to detect stimuli. So if you look across a few of these papers, there's a little bit of evidence from collectively across the field, but it's still very much an incomplete story. We need more studies in this space. So we did studies like that, and we wrote some reviews in that space. As you well know, the technological barriers are falling quickly, and we have these new abilities to do all kinds of cool training studies, naturalistic studies, studies in virtual reality, studies that are more like brain training. So with Graham Erickson, we did a review of these different approaches, kind of looking really to classify the different types of approaches that are being used rather than talk about the evidence for them. But the conclusion there is that now the opportunity costs are much lower. It's much easier now to go out and do training studies that can be carefully controlled using technological devices that can bring the intervention to the athletes. And so we're working on a few different training programs that use these technological innovations. And I'll tell you about the VR stuff in a minute, because that's cool. And I read your papers very carefully. But first, let me tell you about a study that we just completed, and it's under review right now, the paper, which in this case, what we wanted to do was bring clinical trial level experimental control to sports science intervention testing. And so with Nicholas Port at University of Indiana and his team of optometry students and my team of researchers at Duke, we devised a study where we were going to test vision training in the Duke and the Indiana baseball teams. And we pre-registered it, meaning we said before the study what we were going to do and what our hypotheses were, which is what you have to do to have a well-done clinical trial. And we randomized batters at both schools into two groups, either a group that trained with vision training instruments, meaning things like the strobe glasses or some of these perceptual decision-making training tasks, or we use this LED light rail, which is really neat. It's a 20-foot long string of LEDs that can zip down up to 120 miles an hour. Cool. We had them do circuit training with these different devices over about 10 weeks of the fall season a year ago. And the other half of the players did placebo training. So we really, I think one of the cool innovations here was Nick and his team in Indiana developed a series of training circuit drills that really had vision elements excluded. So we would do things like train binocular drills monocularly. So instead of using both eyes to create depth and train that, we would have them do them monocularly. Okay. Or we would create depth with a prism and then remove it with a lens. So it felt like vision had been changed, but it hadn't. And then we had them do different training activities that scaled up in difficulty, from doing kind of puzzles to doing Jenga to doing operation. So they got more and more difficult. And the two groups did this training over several weeks, and we measured a few things before and after. We measured some of their visual abilities before and after. We measured their batting practice performance, measured using TrackMan data, so we could get their exit velocity, their launch angle, and hit distance. And then for the players that were there the year before and the year after, we also looked at their NCAA game statistics. Okay. So in all of these cases, we could compare between the two training groups for the pre and the post training assessment. And what we ended up finding was the group that trained with the vision training instruments, the things we thought were really active vision training, led to pretty substantial increases in their quantified batting practice performance. So their hit distance went up substantially, their launch angle went up, their exit velocity went up, whereas we didn't see changes in their pre and post vision assessments, and we didn't see changes in their game statistics from the preseason to the postseason. But in that case, we only had a few observations because a lot of these players either weren't there the year before or got drafted the year after.
Yeah. No, I was looking. That's really great. You did a really good job kind of controlling for possible motivational effects. The thing that I always actually measured the process underlying things you expected to affect with the training. So, yeah, and that's really interesting because it kind of either adds to the effects you were talking about before, which seemed to be more the pitch recognition decision. This sounds more like it's actually helping them, the actual act of swinging, squaring up the ball better, swinging at the right attack angle, all those kind of things.
Yeah, it actually included a lot of things. So like, for example, the strobe drills started with very simple things like catching a ball one-handed, to making decisions on balls to catch, to then going out to the batting cages and hitting off of a tee and then hitting soft toss. So there was much more, I think, in the Rob Gray words, ecological validity in this training. We had him actually training with baseball activities. So I think the important thing to note there is that while we had some significant effects, it's still a very small preliminary study. It really invites the need to replicate and to do it again with more athletes and have better power. And I don't want to try to make the claims that any one of these studies is definitive. They're just bricks in a wall, and we're trying to build evidence. So
definitely, I agree, and we need more and more of them. I get one of the things I would ask, is I can sympathize with the challenge of doing these. You mentioned technology. The other is just kind of the practicality of, and I guess, would you, if you had your preference, would you put all these different kind of combination vision things in as the manipulation? Or as a scientist, we probably would rather do just strobe training, I think that's a hard sell sometimes when, you're actually testing real players and trying to develop real players. It's hard to sometimes get the control that we'd like.
Certainly. And there's two elements to it. One is just logistically and pragmatically, how do you do this type of research in a group of individuals that have extreme demands on their time? Also, we've been incredibly fortunate to work with really fantastic coaches who are willing to let us have control groups, right? We have a placebo training group, and that's 100% necessary for good science. But most of the time, if a coach or trainer says, I think it works, I want everybody to have it, or they say, I don't think it works and I don't want anyone to have it. So, the coaches at Duke and Indiana have been fantastic to work with, and they let us do good science. So the logistics are challenging, and I feel very fortunate to have been in a position to be able to overcome some of them.
No, I agree. It is that is a really nice thing to have. And what we've had to do is promise the training later on. We show it works to everybody, that kind of thing. And it's a challenge.
And we do that too. We make the active intervention available to the control group, just like we would do in a clinical trial, pharmaceutical or other medical intervention.
Yeah. So do you think it's safe to say that it's not been these are bad words for science. It's not been disproven that it works. It's more of a lack of good studies. So there's not a lot, there's also the file drawer problem, but there's not a lot of evidence showing these things don't work. There just hasn't been a lot of good studies that have evaluated it.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. So we do have a way to go. Can you tell me about your VR training study?
Yeah. So to follow up on the vision training controlled trial we did, coaching staff at Duke has been very keen on trying to embed perceptual decision-making training for batters. Mm-hmm. So, the idea is you have this very time-limited period to make a decision to swing or not. And as you know very well, VR offers this unique opportunity to train in situations where you can be presented with really highly ecologically valid stimuli, meaning actual avatars of pitchers you're going against using pitch trajectories that come from real pitches that they may have thrown. And then you do training under basically go, no-go decision-making tasks. So swing if it's a fastball, don't swing if it's not. Swing if it's in the strike zone, don't swing if it's not. And so the coaching staff at Duke said, hey, this is really cool. Why don't we work together to test some of this stuff? And so at first we set up some kind of video projection in the batting cage. And then we realized that the opportunity cost in the commercial market space had really changed. And now there were commercial solutions to this, one of which is called Win Reality. And they have basically a pitch simulation platform that uses a head-mounted VR. And so we said, okay, well, let's bring this into the lab and see if we can get it under experimental control and test if three things. First, does it correlate with real game performance? Meaning, do people who do better or worse on virtual pitch simulations actually do better or worse on pitches when they're in real game situations? The second is leveraging the really rich data structure, because this is all quantified in four-dimensional space, and ask the question, what features of pitches lead people to make correct or incorrect decisions? Is it the handedness of the pitcher? Is it the type of pitch? Is it the strike count? Is it the spin velocity? Is it all these different features of pitches? And then the third question we could ask is, does training with these simulations actually lead to better game performance? Mm-hmm. And so we set off this preseason, really to answer the first and the second question. Does the performance on the pitch simulator correlate with game performance? And we have just now gotten half of a season. We got shut down because of COVID. So we're currently analyzing that data, and so stay tuned. And then the second question we're asking is about the relationship between features of pitches and decision-making. And we can see, probably unsurprisingly, that there's a very strong signal in there. Different pitches are easier or harder. Different pitchers are easier or harder. Different contexts are easier or harder. But the cool thing is now we can add eye tracking in. So we can start to get some of these physiological measurements that are available in the eye tracker or in the head-mounted VR display. So we're adding that in, and this is data that is currently on my desktop being analyzed. We were hoping to be a little farther along, but obviously the world has changed over the last month. So we're eager to return to this, and it really highlights how much data is now available in these platforms. And so we really want to make use of this data and start to ask some of these questions with the VR platform.
Yeah, I think there's so many questions we can start to answer about perception, and especially specifically in baseball that we haven't been able to address to date. No, I look forward to seeing that. Yeah, so the last thing I wanted to ask you about was TDCS studies you've done. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you've done in that area and kind of what you see as the potential maybe for sports in brain stimulation?
Certainly. So going back to the kind of cognitive neuroscience background that I have in my lab, we really look at this in terms of measuring brain and behavior with correlations. So we could have someone do an experiment while we measure their brain activity with EEG, which measures brain waves, or with fMRI, which measures blood flow changes. And those are correlational. So behavior goes up, brain goes up, or behavior goes down, brain goes down. But we can also modulate brain directly. The brain is an electrical organ. People don't oftentimes think about that. It's a bunch of batteries that are really organized and humming, talking back and forth to each other. And so by adding or taking away electrical or magnetic current, we can change the way the brain works. And so we've known about this for a long time in psychiatry. We've been using approaches like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is using magnets to change brain activity. And that works well. It's FDA approved for treatment of depression and another number of other indications. But the opportunity cost is very high. You have to be in a hospital to do that. But we can add or subtract electrical currents to the brain using technology, which is actually strikingly simple, which is almost just a 9-volt battery with sponge electrodes on the scalp. And this is called transcranial electric stimulation. And you can either turn it on and leave it on, which is direct current, or you can alternate it between positive and negative flow, which is alternating current. And so we've learned over years that this has an effect. It changes the function of the brain. We also know that the motor cortex is very conveniently located right on the kind of surface center part of the head. So it's accessible to these electrical currents. And so then the question becomes, can you add or subtract currents while people are practicing motor skills in a way that changes the plasticity of the learning of these motor skills? And so there's a number of different approaches to this, and there's different technology that's come out that allows people to do this commercially with themselves, with athletes. And so we were really interested in this, again, coming from a kind of precision neuroscience approach. We wanted to do careful pre-registered trials, and we wanted to test quantifiable outputs that are related to motor control. And so while sports is very rich and offers a lot of opportunity to do this, it oftentimes also involves very complicated, big body movements. So in this case, what we've done is we focused in on surgeons, because surgery involves very precise motor control. It's visual motor control. And particularly, we've looked at laparoscopic surgery, because this is a type of surgery where the instruments are inserted into the body along with a closed circuit camera, and the surgeon is looking at a screen up in front of them. So they have to be able to make this kind of weird visual motor transformation where they're operating and not looking at their hands, and they're looking at a screen in front of them. So we've tested whether or not we can add electrical stimulation to the brain while people are doing these surgical simulators, under the idea that adding electrical current makes neurons shift closer to their firing threshold, meaning you add a little bit of current and it makes it easier for neurons to fire action potentials. And therefore, when people are practicing these motor skills, you've made it easier to fire, making it easier to fire together and wire together. And this is the basic principle of Hebbian learning: fire together, wire together. It's neurons that fire together become connected better, and that's what underlies learning. So we have tested this in a study where we had people do 6 20-minute sessions of practice with these laparoscopic surgical simulators. And we had a third of the people do it with electrical current added to their motor cortex on both sides of their head, which is basically mapping onto the primary motor cortex for each hand. We had another third of the people doing it where we were targeting kind of the center middle of their head, which is where the supplementary motor area is. This is where bimanual control happens between the two hands. And then we had a third of the people practice where the electricity wasn't turned on at all. So the first two had the electricity turned on and left on while they practiced, and the third group had it turned on and then turned right off. So they weren't practicing with electrical current. And what did we find? Well, we found that the groups that practiced with the electrical current on led to better learning. They had faster completion times. They had higher scores when we account for penalties or drops of some of the pegs that they're moving back and forth, relative to the group that didn't have electrical current, the placebo group. they learned a little bit like you would expect from any type of motor practice, but the group that practiced with electrical current, and particularly electrical current to the two sides of the head, the primary motor cortices. And this led to a 14% greater improvement for the active group over the control group. And that could generalize to lots of different types of precision motor control that uses both hands. Mm-hmm. So in this case, we've used surgery as our model because it's ecologically valid and because it's important. But we are also wanting to do this with things like marksmanship, mm-hmm. so bimanual control of a gun, or conceivably other types of activities, maybe things like juggling or other bimanual tasks.
Right. And as you say, I guess you like for the technology and to understand what's going on, you need relatively small body movements, right? I don't know if I missed it. In your surgery study, were these complete novices you were training to do laparoscopic, or were they actual surgeons already?
So the study that just is published was all novices. Mm-hmm. We're now doing it also with residents. Mm-hmm. We're starting to do it with residents. And I would also point to a group of colleagues up in Canada, Adam Curtin and his group, who have also been doing this. And they have been working also with residents, and they've been using other types of fine motor control simulators like neurological surgery simulations. So it's now being done both within novices and starting to be done with more practiced surgeons, which really begs the question, is this meant to be used to bring someone who's a total novice quickly up to proficiency, or is it meant to be delivered to somebody who already has proficiency to eke out a little bit more ability or maybe maintain that high level of proficiency? And as of right now, these are very much open questions.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. Also, do you think that this could potentially be used kind of in an additive way to some of the vision training you're talking about? So maybe you have someone doing a pitch recognition training, sitting nice and still and stationary, and you're adding this. Have you been thinking along that avenue?
I think not just myself, but a number of other groups are also thinking along these lines. Ultimately, these are visual motor activities. Things like laparoscopic surgery. There's a few studies that use things like Guitar Hero to improve visual motor control, simulation of something like Guitar Hero. So yes, I think you're training these timing and precision movements, and they involve vision, and you could additively add them with electrical brain stimulation to increase the gain.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting area. I guess very last thing I wanted to mention, you've talked a few things that you're working on now and have upcoming, but what are kind of some of your plans for future research in these areas?
As I mentioned, replication is super important. So in some of these kind of naturalistic studies where we have the opportunity to get data in, one of the important things to do is replicate and test in bigger samples. We want to replicate the vision training study with baseball. We want to continue to derive predictive biomarkers. So I guess one of the elements I didn't get to talk about much is using EEG to try to understand brain states that might be important for preparatory motor activities. We just completed a study, it's also under review at the moment, where we had people train on an Olympic trap shooting simulation in an immersive cave virtual environment. And so they were doing basically trap shooting, a simulation of Olympic trap shooting, and we were measuring their brain waves as they were doing this. And we found that there are certain characteristic frequencies of activity in the brain that are significantly larger in the interval before someone does a shot trial where they hit versus they miss. Mm-hmm. So the amount of these brain frequency signals predicts whether or not they're going to be precise or not in their upcoming shot. And so that's a kind of cool finding. And particularly what we're finding is what's called the beta band activity, which is this frequency of resonance in the brain that is thought to be important for motor control. And so what we want to do now that we have these kind of predictive biomarkers, meaning brain states that predict upcoming motor activity, is generalize it. So is this also the case for batting, for example? So when people are doing the pitch simulator in virtual reality, is it the case that more beta activity is predictive of better batting performance? And does it change when someone is a novice and has to really concentrate versus once they become really, really highly accomplished, and this is automatic, and it might be advantageous to not concentrate. So you might have the opposite signal in a really advanced performer. And then the other thing we could do with this is, again, we've found these signals that are predictive of performance. Can we intervene upon them? So along the same lines as what we're doing with the brain stimulation, can we drive frequencies in the brain that we know are predictive of upcoming performance? So if we add beta band activity to the brain, do we increase someone's performance on an upcoming trial versus if we reduce beta band activity or if we change some other frequency band? So there's a lot of work moving forward to take these kind of biomarkers and these kinds of assessments that maybe predict very short-term upcoming performance, like success on an upcoming shot, or things that are more cross-sectional assessments like the vision screening tests that I talked about that predict next season's baseball performance. So in all cases, we want to use these to try to drive better learning.
Great. That's all really interesting stuff, Greg. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
I appreciate it. Looks like your daughter just...
Yeah, I just saw they did a good job. They almost made an hour. Thanks again for the great discussion, Greg. You can find links to Greg's lab page and several of his papers in the show notes. And remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Cut you quick.